Well, on to our big spotlight for this evening here on The Big Picture. And of course, it is the big global story that we are tracking here. The hostage drama at the Egypt Air aircraft has finally come to an end. The suspected hijacker has surrendered and all the passengers and crew members are safe. Earlier in the day, a domestic Egyptian flight traveling from Alexandria to Cairo was hijacked by a man claiming to be wearing an explosive vest. The aircraft was forced to land in Larnaca in Cyprus. Officials in Egypt and Cyprus identified the alleged hijacker as Saif el-Din Mustafa. The motive, though, behind the hijacking still remains unclear. There are conflicting reports that the man wanted to talk to his estranged wife who lives in Cyprus. Other reports suggested that he is seeking the release of female prisoners in Egypt. There are also reports that he wanted to talk to the European Union officials to move to other airports. Officials in Cyprus, meanwhile, say that the situation is now under control and the suspected hijacker is in custody. So, of course, that story, though, did not happen in India, but of course, it's a time that we can all take an opportunity from that incident to really ponder over and reflect as to how safe are our own airports back home in India. Joining us to talk about that is Mr. Kanu Gohain, who's the former Director General of Civil Aviation. Thank you so very much, sir, for speaking to CNBC TV 18 and waiting patiently as we had to cut out from the live Janet Yellen speech. Sir, many would say that the last few years have been terrifying for air travelers. You've had freak accidents, disappearances, shoot-downs, hijacks. In fact, in 2014, an Ethiopian Airlines was also hijacked, and air travel has suddenly become extremely scary. I mean, you know, one can say that air travel has always been vulnerable since once you're 30,000 feet in the air, there's very little you can do. But despite the technological advances, sir, you know, many who are worried, many who are aviophobes, who are worried of flying, you know, would sort of want some sort of assurance from you. Despite the technological advances, how safe is air travel?
Channel is out.
Can you hear me, sir?
Now I can hear you.
Okay. All right, sir. I
had heard.
If you heard my question, yes, sir. All right. Please answer, sir. Thank you.
I have heard your question partly. Well, air travel is the safest mode of transportation compared to other modes like road, rail, ships, etc. The reason why air travel is safe, as you rightly pointed out, the technological advances which has come into the aviation industry. In an aircraft, you have redundancy in its systems. In its operation, the crew is not only trained, but they are given periodic refresher trainings, not only to operate in normal circumstances, but also to operate in abnormal circumstances. So that contingency part is taken care of in training. Thirdly, there are certain procedures, whether it is engineering, whether it is operation, which have to be strictly followed by every man or woman engaged in this industry, whether in ground or whether in air. So I would like to dispel the fears that aviation, yes, is not safe. No. In the last years, as you have pointed out, there had been some cases of accidents, freak accidents, like the Malaysian aircraft. Then you have the Malaysian aircraft again being shut down on a war zone. Then you have the recent spate of hijacking, or what you call the bomb set cases, which the media has been reporting. So
that's right, sir.
So
yes,
you understand, as aviation is a soft target for such unlawful activities, so it is vulnerable for such activities. But coming to engineering or manufacturing, it is a safe mode of transportation.
Right. Fair enough, sir, and I think that's going to reassure many aviophobes like myself, perhaps. But, you know, as you rightly said, that air travel, you know, at least, you know, continues to be somewhat vulnerable, and many nefarious elements sort of seek to exploit that. In the recent past, we've seen at the backdrop of the Brussels attack, you know, we've been hoax calls made even here in India. Many of the Indian airlines have suffered because of that. As you know, as a senior, you know, DGC official, sir, former DGC official, tell us, how are we prepared to differentiate between calls that are hoax and calls that are genuine?
Oh yes, there is a very elaborate procedure, well-defined procedure. Every phone call which is received on giving a bomb threat is immediately analyzed by the Bomb Threat Assessment Committee to determine whether it is a specific or a non-specific. In the case of a specific, the protocol requires checking of everything, the asset, the passengers, the persons traveling, and their baggages, including the catering things. In a non-specific case, it depends to the extent how much it requires to be checked. It can be simple passenger checking and their baggage checking. But the aircraft is also checked, and it's a joint team which goes into it. Now coming to the bomb threat calls. It is not only checking the aircraft and the passengers and letting it go. The investigation is required to be carried out to trace that call, threat call. I remember that once when it had happened, maybe after the Kandahar case, every aviation telephone had to be installed with the caller ID. And not only that, people who receive such calls are trained to fret out information from the caller as to which flight, which time, and etc. If there's a mismatch between the schedules, then one can say that it is not a specific one. So it is very clear-cut, specific and non-specific.
Yes. All right, so we are running out of time, and I still need to sort of squeeze in a couple of questions. You know, many would say that, you know, from the period 2004 and between 2004 and 2008, air traffic in India saw this exponential growth. And you were the DGCA between 2006 and 2008, and there were many reports at that point which said that how DGCA was perhaps underprepared to suddenly meet this, meet this rise in air traffic. Was that the case, sir, and how does one deal with it in such a situation?
Well, in my time, yes, there was an exponential growth, nearly 45%. But there, we had our strategies placed, how to balance the growth with the safety parameters. We had introduced many measures, right from training programs to surveillance programs, and to determine that the growth is not affecting the safety per se. However, we had a handicap. The handicap at that time was the staff, because you have safety protocols on paper, but until and unless they are implemented, and it is ensured that the implementation is in its truest term through process of surveillance, one cannot achieve that part of balancing. So we had to adopt certain measures, and luckily, or you may say, we had been able, with the help of those understaffed people, to manage the balance between the growth and the safety.
Right. Absolutely. So one final question I want to ask you. In early 2014, we saw the US FAA downgrading India to Category 2, which was seen as being hugely embarrassing. Of course, the US FAA, then reversed that decision. You think that was the big turning point in terms of really sort of, waking up to how Indian airports needed to sort of be upgraded as far as safety was concerned?
No. In my personal opinion today, no longer being in the government, I do not agree with the FAA system of auditing. Auditing of a system is necessary to find out your internal deficiencies, and if it is done by a third party, these deficiencies have some credence, and one is to take remedial measures. It is not a question of upgrading or downgrading. I would like to remind you that when the FAA first came into India for auditing, that time India got Star 1, that is the highest category. Now, I do not accept the point that from that period to this latest period, that our civil aviation has degraded to that level that the Americans could put it into category 2. And I'd further like to add, under the ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization auditing system, internationally they do not have this upgrading, downgrading. They have fixed 8 parameters, right from training, right from legislations, right from operational surveillance, and you know like that. And then they mark out the average of the world average. And then they tell you these are your values against the world average, and you have to pull it up.
Absolutely, yes. So which we eventually did, and the USFA once again, you know, brought us back to category 1. But certainly, sir, your point is well taken, because even at that point, many questions were raised with respect to that downgrade. But we'd like to appreciate your time, taking your time out and being part of this big picture. It was a big story, a global story. Thank you so very much for joining us. With